Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the foundations, the bedrock of how economies actually work.
That's right.
You've sent over some great core material chapters covering economics and economic reasoning, economic institutions, and also supply and demand.
Yeah, the essentials.
So our mission today is to pull out those really crucial insights, give everyone a solid handle on how economies function from our own individual choices right up to the big global picture.
Exactly. We'll be tackling some pretty fundamental questions like what even is an economy?
Right.
And how do different societies go about organizing things? Thinking about, say, capitalism versus socialism.
Uh-huh.
We'll also look at the key players, households, businesses, government, what are their roles?
Sure.
And then wrap up with the basics of supply and demand, the engine that really drives markets.
Yeah, and there's some really interesting angles in here, I think. We'll see how economists tend to think the hidden forces shaping prices.
Yeah, that's always fascinating.
And even why global economic policy looks different from national stuff. Yeah. We'll try to connect it all to the real world, make it stick.
Sounds good.
Okay, so where do we start? What exactly is economics, and why do we even study it?
Well, fundamentally, economics is the study of how humans coordinate their wants and desires.
Coordinate.
But it's coordination within certain constraints, Given the decision-making mechanisms we have, social customs, political realities.
Constraints, like rules.
Yeah, partly. The source materials highlight three central problems, or maybe challenges, every economy faces. What stuff should we produce, and how much?
Okay, the what.
Then, how should we produce it? Technology, resources, labor.
The how.
And finally, for whom? Who gets the stuff once it's made?
What, how, and for whom. That sounds pretty straightforward. Why call them problems?
Well, the problem comes from something really basic, scarcity.
Right. Not enough to go around.
Pretty much. Individual societies, we generally want more than can actually be produced with the resources available.
So the goods are too few for all the desires.
Exactly. And importantly, the degree of scarcity isn't fixed. It changes. Technology can reduce scarcity for some things.
Like inventing a new way to make something cheaper.
Right. Or human action, maybe discovering new resources, but also new wants are always emerging.
Yeah, as soon as we solve one thing, we want something else. Okay, so scarcity forces choices. How do we make those choices? Is that where economic reasoning comes in?
Precisely. Economic reasoning is basically a way of thinking, a framework for making decisions by comparing costs and benefits.
Okay, weighing the pros and cons.
Yeah, but specifically focusing on the important elements, trying to filter out the noise. And a huge part of this is thinking marginally.
Marginally, meaning?
Marginal cost and marginal benefit. Marginal cost is the additional cost you incur for doing one more thing or producing one more unit, over and above the costs you've already sunk.
Okay, the cost of the next step.
Exactly. And marginal benefit is the additional benefit you get from that next step.
So not the total benefit, just the extra bit. So how does that help you decide?
Well, the basic economic decision rule is pretty simple. If the marginal benefits of an action are greater than the marginal costs, you should probably do it.
Makes sense.
If the marginal costs outweigh the marginal benefits, probably best not to.
Don't do it. Okay. And this ties into opportunity cost, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Opportunity cost is fundamental here.
Remind us what that is again.
Opportunity cost is the benefit you could have gained from the next best alternative that you gave up when you made your choice.
Right, the value of the thing you didn't do.
Exactly. And crucially, the benefit of the thing you did choose should always be higher than that opportunity cost. That's the whole basis of cost-benefit thinking.
Can you give an example?
The classic one is college. The opportunity cost isn't just tuition and books, it's also the income you could have earned working full-time instead. That's a big part of the cost.
Right, the lost wages. That makes a lot of sense. What about for bigger things, like government decisions?
Yeah. Same principle applies. If the government spends billions on, say, a new weapon system, the opportunity cost might be improved healthcare or better schools, or maybe infrastructure projects that didn't get funded because the money went to defense.
So it's always about trade-offs.
Yeah.
What you give up.
Always. Understanding opportunity cost shows you the real price of any decision.
Okay, so individuals make choices based on marginal costs, benefits, and opportunity costs. How does this all scale up?
Yeah.
How are societies organized to handle all these decisions?
Economic systems, right?
Exactly. And the readings emphasize that markets, which are central to how many economies like the U.S. operate, don't exist in a vacuum. They rely heavily on institutions.
Institutions. You mean like banks and companies?
Not just those. Institutions are the rules of the game, basically. Both formal rules, like laws protecting private property or the legal system enforcing contracts,
Okay.
and informal rules, like social customs, trust, cultural norms about fairness. All these constrain and shape how we interact economically.
So it's the whole structure underneath the buying and selling. Precisely. The U.S. economy is described as a market economy, fundamentally based on private property.
Meaning individuals mostly own things and decide what to do.
Largely, yes. Individuals decide the what, how, and for whom to produce. And markets coordinate this mainly through prices, rewards, and payments that signal what's wanted and what's profitable. Price fluctuations guide everything.
And how does this contrast with, say, capitalism and socialism? Those terms get thrown around a lot.
They do. The sources define capitalism as a system where the means of production, factories, machines, land, that sort of thing, are owned by a relatively small group, the capitalists.
Okay, private ownership focused.
Right. Socialism, on the other hand, is presented, at least in principle, as being based more on individuals' goodwill or cooperation. Society, perhaps through the state, decides the what, how, and for whom.
So, more collective decision-making.
Theoretically. The idea often cited is from each according to his ability to each according to his need, aiming for the societal good.
And the news often mentions countries like China or Venezuela in this context.
Yeah, the readings note they're often described as having socialist elements, but its complex real-world systems are usually mixed.
Not purely one thing or the other.
Right. There's also the idea of a centrally planned socialist economy or command economy. There, the government explicitly owns the means of production and planning boards set output goals and direct firms.
Like the old Soviet model.
Kind of, yeah. But an interesting point the material makes is that economists now often focus less on these big labels, capitalism versus socialism, and more on the specific institutions within an economy. How do property rights actually work? How effective is the legal system? What are the specific regulations? Those details often matter more for outcomes than the broad label.
That makes sense. The rules on the ground matter more than the ism. Okay, so in a market economy like the U.S., how do the main players, households, businesses, government interact? There's a model for this, right?
Yes, the circular flow model. It's a simplified picture, but useful.
Okay.
It shows households primarily as consumers, but also as suppliers of labor and capital.
Right. We work and we own stuff.
Businesses are the producers. And government is in there too, doing a couple of things. Plus, international connections are increasingly important.
And this flow happens in specific markets.
Two main ones are highlighted: the factor market and the goods market.
Factor market. What's that?
That's where the inputs, the factors needed for production, are bought and sold. Think labor, capital like machines, raw materials, land, even entrepreneurial skill.
So businesses hire these factors from households?
Largely, yes. Households supply labor, maybe capital through savings and investment. Businesses demand these factors to make their products.
Okay, so they get the inputs from the factor market, then they make stuff and sell it in the goods market.
Exactly. The goods market is where the final products, the finished goods and services we buy, are exchanged. Businesses supply, households demand.
And businesses decide what to make based on profit.
Primarily, yes, in a market economy. They're motivated by profit. But the sources mention consumer sovereignty.
Consumer sovereignty. Sounds powerful.
It means businesses ultimately have to produce what they think consumers will actually buy. If nobody wants it, you won't make a profit for long.
So we vote with our dollars.
That's the idea. Consumer demand really guides production in the long run.
Now, these businesses, they come in different shapes and sizes, don't they?
They do. The main legal forms are sole proprietorships, partnerships, and corporations.
Okay, break those down.
Sole proprietorships are owned by one person, super common, like 72% of businesses by number, according to the data cited. But they only generate about 4% of total business receipts. They tend to be small.
Ah, okay. Partnerships.
Two or more owners, about 10% of businesses, maybe 15% of receipts, still mostly smaller scale.
So the big one is corporations.
Definitely. Only about 18% of businesses by number, but they pull in around 81% of the revenue. They dominate economically.
Wow, 81%. Why such a huge difference?
It comes down to the trade-offs of each structure. Sole props are easy to start, owner has full control, but financing is hard and the owner is personally liable for all debts. Big risk.
Unlimited liability. Ouch.
Yeah. Partnerships share resources, but still usually have unlimited liability for partners. Corporations are more complex, more regulated.
Bureaucracy.
Right. And potential double taxation. But they offer limited liability owners, shareholders, are separate from the company legally.
So your personal assets aren't at risk if the company fails.
Exactly. And crucially, they can raise much more money by selling stock. That lets them grow much, much larger.
Okay, that makes sense why they generate most of the revenue. So businesses produce, households consume. What else do households do in this flow?
While supplying labor is huge, households are the source of the workforce.
Right.
The numbers mentioned, around 162 million in the U.S. labor force in 2018, show how significant that is.
Then we earn income from that labor.
Which we then use to buy goods and services, driving demand. The data on average work weeks, pay differences. It paints a picture of households as major economic players, both as suppliers of inputs and demanders of output.
Okay, so we have households and businesses. Now the government, you said it has two roles.
Broadly speaking, yes, it's an actor in the economy and it's a referee.
Actor and referee, what does it do as an actor?
It collects taxes from households and businesses, and then it spends that money on things like defense, roads, schools, social security. It buys goods and services and employs people.
So it's a big spender and employer.
Very big. In the U.S., with its federal system, federal, state, local governments, they collectively consume around 18% of total output and employ about 22 million people.
Wow.
State and local governments are huge employers, over 19 million, spending about $3 trillion a year heavily on education, health, welfare.
Where do state and local get their money?
It's a mix. Money from the federal government, sales taxes, property taxes, charges for services, income taxes. It varies by state.
And the federal government, where does its money come from?
Mostly individual income taxes and Social Security contributions. Those two make up the vast majority. Corporate income taxes are smaller than excise taxes and other bits.
And what does the federal government spend on?
The biggest chunks are income security things like Social Security, unemployment benefits, and health and education programs. Then defense and interest on the national debt.
Okay, so that's the government as an actor. What about its role as a referee?
As referee, it sets the rules of the game. It establishes the legal framework.
Like property rights, contract enforcement.
Yes. And also regulations on businesses and households. Think equal opportunity laws, labor laws about working conditions, safety standards, antitrust laws to prevent monopolies.
So trying to make the market work fairly and efficiently.
That's the idea. The sources list 6 broad roles for government in a market economy, providing stable institutions and rules, promoting competition, correcting externalities.
Externalities. Like pollution.
Exactly. Costs or benefits that affect third parties not involved in the transaction. Also, ensuring economic stability and growth, providing public goods.
Public goods. Like?
Things the market might not provide enough of on its own, like national defense or basic research. Everyone benefits, hard to charge individuals.
Got it. And the last one.
Adjusting for undesirable market results, like maybe excessive inequality.
But government intervention isn't always perfect either, is it? The idea of government failure.
Right. Sometimes the market fails to produce the best outcome. That's market failure. But sometimes government attempts to fix things actually make them worse. That's government failure.
So policymakers have to decide which problem is worse.
Exactly. It's a constant balancing act. Which failure is less costly?
Okay. We focus mostly domestically. How does the global economy fit in? The U.S. isn't an island.
Far from it. The U.S. economy is deeply woven into the world economy. It's a huge player, about 15% of world output, but still reliant on global trade and investment.
And we have global corporations operating everywhere.
Right. Big companies with production and sales in many countries. They bring jobs, technology, competition, but also raise challenges.
Challenges, like regulation.
Well, there's no single world government to set rules for these global corporations or enforce global agreements easily.
So how is coordination handled?
Through international institutions. They provide forums for countries to negotiate and coordinate.
Like the UN.
The UN is one, focused on general cooperation. More specific to economics, you have the World Bank.
Lending to developing countries.
Right. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, deals with monetary issues, financial stability.
Yeah.
There's the G7, the group of major industrial economies coordinating policy, and trade agreements like NAFTA, now USMCA, between the US, Mexico, and Canada.
So it's coordination through these bodies, but it's different from national policy.
Yes, because there's no overarching authority with strong enforcement powers. It relies more on negotiation and voluntary compliance. Global policy is inherently more complex.
Right. Okay, we've got the structure, the players, the global context. Now let's drill down into the core mechanism of markets, supply and demand. This is where prices come from, isn't it?
Absolutely. Understanding supply and demand is key to understanding how markets work and prices get set. Let's start with demand.
Okay. Demand. It's just wanting something, right?
Not quite in economic terms. It's wanting something and being able to afford it and having a plan to buy it.
Okay. Want, afford, plan.
And the quantity demanded is the specific amount people plan to buy at a specific price during a certain time.
And there's a basic rule about price and quantity demanded. The law of demand.
Yes. The law of demand states that other things remaining equal, the lower the price of a good, the higher the quantity demanded.
So cheaper means people buy more.
Generally, yes. And conversely, the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded.
Why is that?
Partly because as something gets more expensive, people look for substitutes. They switch to alternatives.
Okay. And this is shown by the demand curve.
Right. The demand curve graphically shows this relationship. It slopes downward, showing the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded.
So a change in the price itself causes a movement along that curve.
Exactly. If the price of coffee goes up, people buy less coffee. That's a movement along the existing demand curve for coffee.
But sometimes the whole curve moves.
Yeah.
A shift.
Yes. A shift in the demand curve happens when something other than the good's own price changes.
Like what?
Many things. Changes in consumer income.
If I get a raise, I might buy more coffee.
Right. For a normal good, higher income means more demand. The curve shifts right. For an inferior good, maybe cheap instant noodles, higher income might mean less demand curve shifts left as you buy better stuff.
Okay, normal versus inferior goods. What else shifts demand?
Prices of related goods. If the price of a substitute, like tea, goes up, demand for coffee might increase. Shift right.
Because coffee is relatively cheaper now.
Exactly. Or if the price of a complement, something you use with coffee like sugar or cream, goes down, demand for coffee might also increase. Shift right.
Makes sense.
Also, changes in tastes or preferences, population size or demographics, expectations about future prices.
If I think coffee prices will skyrocket next week, I might buy more now.
Precisely. And finally, taxes on consumers or subsidies can shift demand. A tax makes it effectively more expensive, decreasing demand. A subsidy makes it cheaper, increasing demand.
Wow, okay. Lots of factors shifting that curve. Now let's flip it. Supply.
Right. Supply is about the seller's side. It's the quantity of a good a seller is willing and able to sell at various prices. Again, holding other things constant.
Willing and able.
And quantity supplied is the specific amount offered at a specific price.
Is there a law of supply?
Yes, and it generally works the other way to demand. The law of supply states that, other things equal, the higher the price of a good, the greater the quantity supplied.
So higher price means producers want to sell more.
Typically, yes. Higher prices usually mean higher potential profits, which incentivizes producers to offer more. So the supply curve generally slopes upwards.
Upward slope, okay. And a change in price means moving along this supply curve.
Correct. If the price of coffee beans rises, existing coffee farms might harvest more intensively, or new suppliers might be drawn in. That's a movement along the curve to a higher quantity supplied.
And what causes the whole supply curve to shift?
Again, factors other than the good's own price. A big one is the price of inputs, the things used to make the good.
Like labor, fertilizer for coffee.
Exactly. If input prices rise, production costs go up, and supply decreases, the curve shifts left. Sellers offer less at every price.
What about technology?
Technology improvements usually lower costs or increase efficiency, which increases supply, shifts the curve right.
More supply at every price.
Okay. The state of nature matters too. Good weather might increase crop supply. A hurricane could decrease it.
Right.
Expectations about future prices also affect supply. If sellers expect prices to rise sharply soon, they might hold back supply now, shifting the curve left temporarily.
Interesting.
The number of suppliers in the market is another factor. More sellers means more supply, shift rate. And again, taxes and subsidies matter. Taxes on production increase costs, decreasing supply, shift left. Subsidies decrease costs, increasing supply.
So input costs, tech, nature, expectations, number of sellers, taxes, subsidies, all shift supply. Okay, we have demand sloping down, supply sloping up. How do they determine the price?
Equilibrium. Exactly. Equilibrium is where these opposing forces balance. It's the point where the quantity demanded by buyers equals the quantity supplied by sellers.
Where the curves cross on the graph.
That's the visual representation, yes. The price at that intersection is the equilibrium price, and the quantity is the equilibrium quantity. The market naturally tends toward this point.
What if the price isn't at equilibrium?
Good question. If the current price is above equilibrium, the quantity supplied will be greater than the quantity demanded. You have a surplus or excess supply.
Too much stuff, not enough buyers.
Right. Sellers can't sell all they want at that high price, so there's pressure for the price to fall.
Makes sense. What if the price is too low, below equilibrium?
Then quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. You have a shortage or excess demand.
Lots of buyers, not enough stuff.
Exactly. Buyers are competing for limited goods, maybe bidding the price up, so there's pressure for the price to rise.
And these pressures push the price back towards
the equilibrium price, where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, and the market clears.
the invisible hand at work.
That's one way to think about it, yeah. The interaction of buyers and sellers pushing towards balance.
Okay, so what happens to equilibrium if one of those shift factors changes? Like if demand increases.
Okay, let's say demand increases, the demand curve shifts, right? The original equilibrium price, quantity demanded is now higher than quantity supplied. There's a shortage.
Price goes up.
Right. The shortage puts upward pressure on the price. As the price rises, quantity supplied increases, movement along the supply curve, and quantity demanded decreases, movement along the new demand curve, until a new equilibrium is reached.
This new equilibrium will have
a higher price and a higher quantity traded compared to the original equilibrium.
Okay. What if supply increases? Curve shifts, right?
If supply increases at the original price, quantity supplied now exceeds quantity demanded, there's a surplus.
Price goes down.
Yes, the surplus puts downward pressure on the price. As the price falls, quantity demanded increases and quantity supplied decreases along the new supply curve until you reach a new equilibrium. A lower price and a higher quantity traded.
So shifts in these curves change both the equilibrium price and quantity.
Exactly. An increase in demand raises price and quantity. A decrease in demand lowers price and quantity. An increase in supply lowers price and raises quantity. A decrease in supply raises price and lowers quantity.
That framework seems really powerful for analyzing markets. Are there any, caveats or limitations?
Oh, definitely. It's a model, a simplification. In reality, supply and demand might be interconnected in complex ways. The other thing's constant assumption is strong. Lots of things can change at once.
Yeah, the real world is messy.
And there's the fallacy of composition. Just because something works for one market doesn't mean the same logic applies perfectly to the whole economy. But despite these limitations, it's an incredibly useful starting point.
Absolutely. It gives you a way to think about price changes.
Yeah.
Okay, one last area mentioned was the connection between markets and overall economic growth.
Yeah, the sources point to the dramatic rise in living standards, particularly over the last 250 years or so, and how that coincides with the development and spread of market economies.
So markets fuel growth. How?
A key mechanism is facilitating specialization and trade. Markets allow people, regions, countries to focus on what they do relatively best.
Comparative advantage.
That's the core idea. You don't have to be the absolute best at producing something, just relatively better, meaning you give up less to produce it compared to others.
Lower opportunity costs.
Exactly. If everyone specializes based on their comparative advantage and then trades, total output increases, and everyone can potentially consume more than they could if they tried to produce everything themselves.
The Pakistan textiles, Belgium chocolates example.
Right. They specialize, they trade. Both are better off than trying to make both textiles and chocolates domestically, perhaps.
And we see this with globalization. Production moving to where it's cheapest.
Yes. The shift of manufacturing, like textiles to Bangladesh, where labor costs are lower, is an example. It raises incomes there, lowers prices for consumers here. It's guided by seeking lower costs, often related to comparative advantage.
But that also means job losses in some sectors here.
It does. And the sources suggest that for advanced economies like the U.S. to thrive, the key is constant innovation, developing new comparative advantages in higher value goods and services to create new high-paying jobs to replace the ones lost to global competition.
Always needing to adapt and innovate.
That seems to be the lesson from history and economic theory.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered so much ground, from scarcity and reasoning through systems, players, global links, and down to supply and demand. to kind of wrap it up, what are the absolute key takeaways?
I think the big things are, 1, economics is fundamentally about choice under scarcity. 2, economic reasoning often involves thinking at the margin and considering opportunity costs. 3, institutions, the rules of the game, really matter for how economies function. 4, the circular flow shows the interdependence of households, businesses, and government. And 5, supply and demand are powerful forces determining prices and quantities in markets, driven by predictable factors. Understanding these gives you a real framework for analyzing economic events.
That's a great summary. And for everyone listening, maybe some food for thought. Thinking about this global interconnectedness, the drive for efficiency, how do your own choices as a consumer, maybe as a worker or future entrepreneur, fit into these larger forces?
Yeah, and also what role do the institutions around you, the laws, the norms, the government policies play in shaping the economic opportunities and challenges you personally encounter?
Really makes you think about your own place in the system.
Definitely. And remember, we've just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
Things like market failures, the details of government intervention, global trade complexities, there's so much more to explore.
Maybe dig into those international institutions or just watch the news through that supply and demand lens you mentioned.
Exactly. Economics is everywhere, and there's always more to learn.